Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Thursday, June the 18th, and today we're reading Luke chapter 21, which has a hidden surprise at the end, for which we're going to have to go on a bit of a treasure hunt. And what we'll find will be pure gold. But first we're going to start with two very small copper coins. Jesus is in the temple compound. The size of 8 football fields, the compound is a huge platform constructed by Herod to support his majestic rebuilding of the far more humble temple which it replaced. Now this whole area, which could hold tens of thousands of pilgrims, is referred to in the scripture as the temple, but the great majority of what we read in the Gospels happens not in the building itself, but in the surrounding grounds. And this included the temple courts, the royal portico, the area where the merchants sold animals for sacrifices and money changers exchanged Roman coins to shekels, as well as a large area for women and Gentiles, and then an area or courtyard which surrounded the building where the burnt offerings were made and so on. It was and remains a huge complex. The immense platform is still there, as we discussed yesterday, but as Jesus foretells in this chapter, the temple itself is long gone. So there's Jesus and the disciples, and he's watching the people pass through the area where the offerings were made. Luke writes, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. Mark, in his rendition, tells us a bit more. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. Now, this isn't a Sunday morning type of offering, unfortunately. This is Passover week, and pilgrims are gathering in Jerusalem from near and far for the big celebration. And for many, this is their one-time annual visit to the temple. Now, as a result, some substantial funds are being donated. Luke delicately says, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury, but Mark, echoing the voice of Peter, says, many rich people threw in large amounts. You can imagine the bags of coins ostentatiously being tossed in with a big bang and jingle, impressing the bystanders. Jesus is forever after people making a big show of throwing money around for the approval and adoration of the crowd, and he's always critical of such actions, as he had been at the conclusion of the previous chapter. Now, that's not to say that Jesus rejects the generosity of the wealthy. What he does say is, give from your heart in order to give thanks to God, not to impress others. Now he adds a different layer. Listen. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small coins, 2 very small copper coins. Truly I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. It's the proportion which is given and the spirit of generosity and self-sacrifice in which it is given that truly impresses God, not the amount itself. Now, sometimes people ask me, how much should I give? Well, there's no fixed appropriate amount, for everyone is in a different economic situation. Some are able to give large amounts, some far less in terms of dollars and cents. The key is, are you giving generously or are you giving grudgingly? This idea goes all the way back to the Cain and Abel story, way back in Genesis 4. There we read that Cain gave some of the fruits of his labor, while Abel brought to God the best of his. To say it differently, Cain gave from the leftovers, while Abel gave what came first, the first fruits, as the old language put it, the best. It's the very definition of grudgingly versus generously. Reminds me of the story of my nephew Gregory when he was just a little fellow. Before going to Sunday school, he would shake his piggy bank and generously bring the quarter that would come out to church. One Sunday morning, he came stomping down the stairs upset. "What's the matter?" his mother asked. Gregory held up a loonie. "Jesus got lucky today." Again, the very definition of grudgingly versus generously. A rabbi friend of mine was talking to me about this. He said, giving what we don't notice or what we wouldn't miss isn't giving generously. To give generously means to give that which is noticeable to us. It's an amount we miss. That's when we know we're being generous. It's kind of a variation on the give till it hurts idea. Give till we would miss what we're giving. That one made me think and became a guide for me. Now, for Jesus, he commends the widow for giving not only generously, but sacrificially. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. That's another level altogether. We see sacrificial giving commended throughout the Gospels and into the book of Acts. Remember the story of the rich fellow who walked away from Jesus, not able to bear the thought of giving sacrificially. Remember also the story of Zacchaeus, who joyfully did so. Now, the Apostle Paul, writing to his protege Timothy, balances all of this out for us. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. He says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." Key line there: to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Now, that's good advice for us all. The remainder of this chapter is very close to word for word of similar passages in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And we've covered those extensively. While many people work very hard to bring these words regarding the destruction of the temple into our day, Jesus is quite specific regarding the time frame within a generation of his listeners and Luke's readers, which certainly came true as the Romans laid waste to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. Jesus' timely warning to flee to the hills was a lifesaver to the early Christian community, who took Jesus at his word and fled quite literally to the hills in Jordan, a place called Pella, when they saw these events coming. They were able to return to Jerusalem in the 80s when the dust had settled and reestablish the Christian community there, even rebuilding their gathering place on Mount Zion, perhaps the very first purpose-built Christian place of worship in all the world. The foundations of this building still exist, and on top of them is built the Crusader-era cenacle, also known as the Room of the Last Supper. Well, I promised you a surprise at the end of the chapter, and here it is. Chapter 21 does not end at verse 38. To find the actual end of chapter 21 of Luke, we have to turn to the beginning of chapter 8 in the Gospel of John. Now, look at how verses 37 and 38 of Luke chapter 21, those last two verses, mirror John chapter 7 verse 53 to John chapter 8 verse 2, the block of 3 verses. Even more amazingly, the first 11 verses of John chapter 8 are not written in Johannine Greek, but in Luke's style. These styles of writing are so distinct that when I was learning New Testament Greek at Trinity College in Toronto, I was learning it from the Gospel of John. I was getting reasonably proficient after some long months of hard study. But when I hit chapter 8 of John, the language and style was so different, I couldn't read it anymore. But at verse 12 in the Gospel of John, I was comfortably on my way again. Now, in our English translations, of course, we don't notice this. The translation, the editors have done all the work for you. But many modern translations, though, will put this section of John in italics with a note that it's not in the best, earliest manuscripts. So what happened? Well, it's the story of the woman caught in adultery. We know that Paul's congregations, such as Corinth, for whom the Gospel of Luke was written, were having struggles with appropriate sexual behavior. And this story may have been regarded as a bit too forgiving of adultery, despite Jesus saying, "Go and sin no more." And so it was removed from many copies of Luke's Gospel. However, it continued to be treated with respect, and it kind of floated around unattached until John's community found a place for it in his Gospel. Now, this speaks to me of the respect in which these events from the life of Jesus were regarded. So much so that this story of the woman caught in adultery, while viewed as potentially dangerous, was nevertheless not forgotten, but treasured and preserved and found its way into the Bible again. That's great stuff and pure gold. Tomorrow, we're back to Luke, and only Luke, with chapter 22. a chapter far too big and far too important to cover in one go. So tomorrow, we're going to focus only on Luke's account of the Last Supper. And there's plenty there to keep us occupied. I'll see you then.